Appreciate all of you that are joining us this morning to worship in person, and also those of you who are joining us virtually. It's been about a year since we heard about a novel virus that isn't so novel anymore, is it? And I don't know about you, I've told folks, sometimes I feel like I'm walking through a fog and I can see about 3 feet ahead, because you just don't know what tomorrow holds. You don't know what's coming next. And I appreciate so much your faithfulness and the faithfulness of those of you who are joining us online in desiring to worship as you are this morning. Because this really is a slog. And the important thing in running any race is that you finish it. And what's really difficult is that we don't know where the finish line is, do we, as far as this goes. But what is important is that we faithfully run until we finish, and we will. This will come to an end, everything does. And things will get back to normal, whatever that is anymore. But thank you for your faithfulness. And I think very much we need to pray for one another, that in the midst of this, we remain faithful in our service to God, in our loyalty to Him, and to each other. I want to thank Steve for filling in for me last Sunday. As always, he does an excellent job. We're so blessed to have him here. Carol and I had an opportunity to run away for a few days, went to Branson, went over to Pioneer Woman in Pawhuska and ate at that restaurant that she has there. Good food, by the way. And then went on up and got to spend time with the grandkids. Boy, you miss seeing your grandkids. And got to see the grandkids, and then went back to near Wichita and spent a couple of days with my sister Barb and her husband Steve, and thoroughly enjoyed that. But it was refreshing and good to get away, good to be back. 2 weeks ago, I began a lesson that I entitled Judges Are Fruit Inspectors. And I would like for us to conclude that lesson this morning. We live in a day and time, as I talked about, when judging has kind of become standard. And the more harshly you judge, it seems like, the better. Now, it used to be quite the opposite. I can remember when it was, but boy, it's not that way now. We live in this cancel culture, don't we? Where, boy, if you say something that I don't agree with, if I can get you out of a job, if I can knock you off TV, if I can take you out of the movies, if I can get at you in some way, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to cancel you. And brethren, as we talked about, what we need today desperately as the people of God is to be a counterculture to that cancel culture. To show the world there really is something viable and something different and something beautiful. And I believe we have it in the gospel of Jesus Christ, as Steve talked about last Sunday. But it's very, very easy in a culture where everybody is just harshly judging everybody else and marking them and naming them and putting them in this identity or that identity, to fall into that trap. And we can't do that. We're not called to do that. We're called to show the world something different in the face of that. We looked at Matthew chapter 7, verses 1 through 5 2 weeks ago, where Jesus warns, "Judge not lest you be judged, for with what judgment you judge, you will be judged. And with what measure you meet, it will be measured to you." And he goes on to talk about how important it is that we not look for the speck that is somebody else's eye when we've got a beam in our own eye. That we need to take care of that beam first before we start looking for the specks in other people's eyes. It's absolutely true. And we talked about how profound that wisdom is and how important it is that we implement that in our lives. This morning, I want us to look at two more passages that are just vital in laying down principles that I believe we desperately need to live as Christians in our culture today. And the first passage that I want us to notice is from Matthew 7, verse 6, and then later verses 15 through 20. I'll begin by reading those. Do not give dogs what is holy. Do not throw your pearls before pigs, lest they trample them underfoot and turn to attack you. Beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves. You will recognize them by their fruits. Are grapes gathered from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? So every healthy tree bears good fruit, but the diseased tree bears bad fruit. A healthy tree cannot bear bad fruit, nor can a diseased tree bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Then you will recognize them by their fruits. Now, I want us to look at these two passages, but I want us to look at them in kind of reverse order. Look at verses 15 through 20 first, and the principle that's found there, and then back to verse 6, and I believe a very important principle that we find there. First of all, in verses 15 through 20, Jesus very effectively tells us that there is no more effective means of reaching the truth about a person or a group than the fruit test. And clearly, he's not talking about judging, because he's just warned, don't judge. But he is talking about how important it is, and brethren, it is absolutely vital that we put things to the fruit test. I read a very interesting article the other day in which a man was talking about how we have substituted rhetoric today for logic and reason, and he's absolutely right. And I hate it, but it's true. People are very caught up in what's being said, and they are so caught up in what's being said that they ignore what's being done. And that's a critical mistake in any of our lives. I've told people time and again, if you really want to know somebody's character, turn down the sound. Don't listen to what they say. Look at what they do. Look at their fruit. By their fruit you shall know them. And that is absolutely vital and absolutely true. And more than ever, brothers and sisters, it's important as parents, as grandparents, as Christians, that we be fruit inspectors. And that we pay attention to the fruit that's out there. And that we look not just at what people say, but very much at what they do. For years now, we have seen increasingly what I talked about before. The message of the world, the message of politicians, the message that you just hear on media constantly is one of envy and resentment and division. Okay? We should be envious of the haves if we're the have-nots. We should be envious of this color if we're that color. We should resent everything that's going on. If somebody's prospering and we're not prospering like we think we ought to resent that. And the fruit of that ongoing beating drum of envy and resentment and division can be nothing other than what we see today. It's got to be that way. By their fruit you shall know them. What's the fruit of this being preached and taught? And I say preached because I mean it. As we talked about, there's a very real sense in which politics has become religion. And politicians and others have become preachers. And what are they declaring? Envy and resentment and classifying people in whatever way you choose to classify them and then condemning them. And constantly looking for a scapegoat, somebody to blame for the situation in which you find yourself. Now, what's the fruit of that? Well, How about $1 billion worth of damage this summer in riots all over the country? How about hundreds and thousands of businesses being put out of business because of people who are angry, so angry they're violent? And why are they angry? Because they're being told constantly how they're being used and abused and taken advantage of, and this bitterness and rancor is being preached over and over again. What happened with the Capitol and those barbarians that stormed the Capitol? The same thing. Anger and resentment. And what's going to come from that? Violence. And brethren, when are we going to learn that's not the answer? You know, it breaks my heart. I look at history as it's being taught today, and it's just, go back to the 20th century, okay? Ain't been that long since the 20th century. And I'm amazed what is ignored and forgotten about the 20th century. In the 20th century, a politics of envy and resentment and violence was taught in Russia, in Red China, in Cambodia, in various African nations. Exactly what's being preached here today was being preached there in the last century. And it only cost an estimated 160 million lives. Do you understand that's half the population of the United States of America today, just about? Imagine 1 out of every 2 people in this country being executed. That's how many people were starved to death or killed in genocides with the preaching of this exact message in the 20th century. Who are we kidding? Look at the fruit, brethren. Look at the fruit. Forget the rhetoric. Look at the fruit. And the fruit is horrible. The fruit is repulsive. The fruit is frightening. And yet that's what we see being preached. The same thing goes today with, this whole sexual revolution thing. Everybody just has to express themselves sexually in their own way. We don't have any right to tell anybody basically to inhibit themselves in any way in regard to sexual expression. And it sounds so touchy-feely, wonderful, warm, loving, when you just accept everybody and let everybody do their thing. Turn down the rhetoric. Look at the fruit. Look at the fruit. How about tens of millions of people who've died of AIDS? Courtesy of the sexual revolution. How about countries in Africa? See, you don't hear about it. Countries in Africa that have been devastated by the AIDS epidemic. Hundreds of thousands of orphans. Courtesy of AIDS, because mommy and daddy are both dead. That's fruit. How about an STD epidemic that the press won't talk about, that exists in this country right now? How about the fact that 60% of the babies being born in this country now are being born to single mothers? And all the social ramifications that go with that. We don't want to talk about fruit. Brethren, we need to open our eyes and look at the fruit. And we don't need to be afraid to talk to people about the fruit. And that's not judging. It's not. That's fruit inspecting. That's saying, here is what this undeniably produces. To the very best of my knowledge, there's not a single individual who has kept themselves sexually pure and has remained faithful to their mate who has had to face sexual disease, STDs. There may have been a very, very few who have had to deal with AIDS because of blood transfusions and things like that, but a minuscule number. In other words, if people just practice what we preach, sexual morality as the Bible teaches it, keep yourself pure, stay faithful to your mate. Pretty simple. And Jesus makes that very clear. By their fruit, you shall know them. What's the fruit? The fruit is good health. The fruit is that there's a zillion different diseases and things that you don't have to worry about. There is the fruit. Man, it's undeniable. Listen to the rhetoric on the one side, and what you get is tens of millions of deaths. Look at the fruit on the other side, and what do you get? Happy, healthy people. What God designed and what God wanted. There is no more effective means of reaching the truth about a person or group than the fruit test, brethren. Be wise enough, Jesus says, to put things to the fruit test, not the rhetoric test. The fruit test. Secondly, this one I really wrestled with for a long time. Jesus says, judge not lest you be judged. Don't judge harshly. Krino, harsh judgment, critical judgment. And then in the very next verse, verse 6, do not give dogs what is holy. I left the L out of there. Hoy. And do not throw your pearls before pigs, lest they trample them underfoot and turn to attack you. Don't judge people. And then he talks about people as dogs and pigs. Because he's not talking about dogs and pigs, is he? He's talking about people. Brethren, listen to him. Don't judge, okay? But he just said in verses 15 through 20, check out their fruit. No, by the way, can there be people who have the morals of an animal? That's not judging man, that's just looking at fruit. Okay? Peter will argue that in the book of 2 Peter. Read him. I mean, he flat states it. There are people who live like animals. Okay? Jesus says, you be very aware of the fact that there's dogs and pigs out there and they'll hurt you. And they will. How are you going to know them? You're going to know by their fruit. In Acts chapter 19, biblical example, Acts 19, here's Paul. He's gone into Ephesus. He's preaching the gospel in Ephesus. And there apparently are tons of people who are hearing the good news of Jesus Christ, and they're walking out of idolatry. They're not worshiping Diana. They're not into the black arts anymore. Remember, they bring books worth tens of thousands of dollars. And those books are rare, believe me. You know, it's hard to get a book back then, or a scroll. And they burn them. All these that have to do with the black arts, they burn them because they've rejected them. And the result is what? That dogs and pigs throw a riot. They want to kill Paul, man. They want to destroy Christians because it's hitting them in the pocketbook. It's costing them money. It's making them uncomfortable. Jesus warned about people like that. I had a friend who was doing mission work in India. And he got crossways with a Hindu cult there. And that Hindu cult set out and beat him up so bad that the government of India sent him back here to the States. All he was doing was sharing the gospel. And believe me, that man had a heart for the Indian people. He loved the Indian people. He wanted to free them from some of the superstitious nonsense that binds so many of them. Dogs and pigs got a hold of him, and they beat him half to death. It happens. Jesus says, be aware of that. That's not judging. Man, that's looking at their fruit. And you better understand that there are people out there who so despise the truth that given the opportunity, they'll hurt you. They'll turn and they'll rend you. We need to keep that in mind. That's just being wise, okay? Now, a second passage that I would like for us to notice contains the words of Paul in 1 Corinthians 4, verses 1 through 5. This passage that often often referred to or looked at, and man, it's so important in some of the principles that he lays down here. And I really want you to think about what he says. This is how one should regard us, as servants of Christ and stewards of the mysteries of God. Moreover, it is required of stewards that they be found faithful. Now, listen to him. But with me, it's a very small thing that I should be judged, krino, by you or by any human court. In fact, I don't even judge myself. I'm not thereby acquitted. It is the Lord who judges me. Therefore, do not pronounce judgment before the time, before the Lord comes, who will bring to light the things now hidden in darkness and will disclose the purposes of the heart. Then each one will receive his commendation from God. Incredibly important guidance that's being provided here. 3 points real quickly. Number one, listen to Paul. You don't know what you don't know. I don't know how else to express that, but it's absolutely true. You don't know what you don't know. Done a lot of counseling through the years. I'll guarantee you, there's not just two sides to every story, there's more than two sides. If you only hear one side, you ain't heard the story, have you? When you've heard two sides, you've heard part of the story, but you ain't necessarily heard the whole story. Because a lot of times, both sides are shading what really happened. Okay? You don't know what you don't know, so don't jump to conclusions. Don't judge before the time. And in this culture, we have become champs at that. Well, you saw the video, he's guilty, or he made the accusation, or she made the accusation, they're guilty. Throw the book at him. And then you find out the real truth. And the real truth is nothing like the conclusion that everybody had jumped to. Don't judge before the time. You don't know what you don't know. And that is so painfully true. Okay? We judge fruit. But when it comes to drawing conclusions about people and what they're doing and their motives and their guilt or their innocence, we need to be very careful about jumping to conclusions about that. It is the Lord who will ultimately do the judging. Listen to Paul, this is so important. It's the Lord who judges me. Paul makes an interesting observation in 1 Corinthians 2, verse 11. He'll ask a question. I don't know if you're familiar with it or not. He'll say, who among men knows the thoughts of a man, save the spirit of a man which is in him? I can't read your mind right now. I have no idea where you're at. Hope you're here. Hope you're following. I can't read your mind. I don't know what you're thinking. You're listening to me, but you don't know all the other things that are whirring in my mind. How in the world, if we're not mind readers, can we possibly judge the motives of others? And yet people do it all the time, don't they? Well, he's a part of this group or she's a part of that party. Therefore, they believe, and that may be the farthest thing from the truth. It is the Lord. And I think about this every day because be not many of you teachers, my brethren, knowing ye shall receive a harsher, more critical judgment. 1 Timothy 3, verse 1. James 3, verse 1. That always weighs on my mind. It is the Lord who's going to do the judging. I'll stand before Him. I'll answer to Him. And like Paul says, what other people think really doesn't matter ultimately. Because they're not going to send me to heaven or hell. He is. Okay? He is the judge. And what we need to focus on is pleasing Him. Not what Twitter says, not what Facebook says, not whether you get likes or not how many comments you pull, but are you doing what's pleasing to the Lord? That's what Paul focused on, and that's what we need to focus on. And thirdly, don't confuse, and this is so important, don't confuse the world's standards with those of God. But with me, it's a very small thing that I should be judged by you or by any human court. In fact, I don't even judge myself. Brethren, the world's standards are all messed up. You don't need to worry about being judged by the world's standards because they're the wrong standards. Now, I find people compromising all the time. Well, I don't want people, what people think, ultimately. If their thinking is earthly, sensual, and devilish, if it's based on worldly wisdom, shouldn't matter. It doesn't matter. What matters is godly wisdom. What matters is heavenly wisdom. What matters is pleasing God. That's what matters. That's the standard that I need to be concerned about and that I'm going to answer to, and so are you. And so don't confuse the world's standards with those of God. Right now, there are people out there all the time who are condemning pro-life people. I'm a pro-life person. I assume you are too. Okay? I am 100% against abortion. I am. Against taking the life of the unborn. Therefore, I am against women's reproductive health. I'm a bigot. I'm a misogynist. I'm all kinds of things. Names being called all the time. January 22nd, 1973, the Supreme Court of the United States of America rendered the Roe v. Wade decision, which legalized abortion in this country. Since then, over 60 million babies have been aborted. January 22nd, 1983, my oldest son, Adam, was born to an unwed mother. She was 19. I will always be indebted to the bigoted, nasty, mean, ugly people that encouraged that 19-year-old to keep her baby, that supported her in keeping that baby, that carried her through those last painful, difficult months. And she bore that child, and that's our son. And there's not a January 22nd that doesn't go by that I don't thank God for those people who are so besmirched and vilified today as being so hate-filled. They saved my son's life. By their fruit you shall know them. And these standing up for women's reproductive rights and so on, look at the fruit. How about 60 million dead babies? Versus my son. By their fruit you shall know them. Don't confuse the sick, ugly standards of the world with God's standards. And if you're persecuted because you stand with God's standards, God bless you. Because you're standing where you need to stand and holding to what you need to hold. And we don't need to worry about what the world says. We need to be concerned with what God says and stand for Him. We need to be the counterculture. I love cherries, man. I love cherries. And we were in Walmart, and we were looking at some cherries. You know, cherries ain't cheap, by the way, as y'all know. And I was fixing to get some cherries, and there was a person standing beside me, and they said, you think about buying some cherries? And I said, yeah. They said, listen, these aren't very good. I appreciate that. If they're going to cost me $6 or $7 a pound, it's nice to know that I don't need to buy them. I get a phone call from one of our sisters, and she tells me, go to this store. They've got cherries at about half the price that you're going to find at Walmart, and they're good cherries. They're really, really tasty. Fruit tests, brethren. They're literally sharing with me a fruit test. And I'm the beneficiary. Because I'm not spending $6 or $7 a pound for cherries that don't taste good. I can go buy them for about $3 a pound, which is really cheap, and they are really good cherries. I appreciated those people who done the fruit test and shared with me their wisdom. Do the fruit test and share your wisdom. Seriously, share the wisdom with your children. Share the wisdom with your grandchildren. Share the wisdom with your co-workers. Share the wisdom with those around you. Show them something different. Show them something better. We can. Okay? We've got fruit that we can be proud of. Fruit that we can hold up. Fruit that blesses people's lives. Fruit that truly frees people. Doesn't bond people. Bind people. Okay? It doesn't do that. It does the very opposite. Judges are fruit inspectors. We're not to be judges. But God help us, please, to be wise fruit inspectors. This morning, if we can help you in your walk with the Lord, whether that's to begin that walk as you're baptized into Christ, or if you're struggling in that walk and you need our prayers or encouragement, if we can help you in any way, we ask you to come while we stand and while we sing.
It's great to be together. Great to have you. Now it's time for class. Dan?
Thanks, Steve. It is time for us to begin this morning in class, and if you have your Bibles with you, I'd encourage you to turn to Genesis chapter 3. That's where we'll be studying this morning as we continue to look at the temptation that took place in the garden. We have spent quite a bit of time in this particular section of Scripture, and I think it's worthy of every moment of it because there are so many profound, life-changing lessons contained in the events that occur here. I'm always intrigued by how crisp and short and compact the narrative is. I mean, it's like there's not a single word wasted. And yet contained within that are thoughts and implications and truths that you could spend a lifetime literally exploring. We have talked about how God places Adam and Eve in a garden, and I believe He puts them in an enclosed space for a reason. And a part of that reason is not necessarily for their protection, but it is because this is, in a very real sense, a kind of holy place. This is where they meet Him. He places in that, not accidentally, two trees, a tree of life and a tree of the knowledge of good and evil. No regulation in regard to the tree of life, but a very specific regulation in regard to the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. In the day that you eat thereof, dying you shall die. Do not eat of that tree. Now, the presence of the tree, I believe, clearly indicates, as we've talked about, that it's very important to God that a person choose to do His will, that a person choose Him, that you choose to follow Him. That matters greatly. And so He puts that tree, and that tree is representative of the choice that we all make. Every one of us eventually choose to eat of the fruit of that tree of the knowledge of good and evil, don't we? We choose to disobey God. Now, Eve talks to the serpent, and we spent a couple, 3 weeks talking about who the serpent is, the fact that the serpent is the evil one, that's the devil. And he clearly hates God and hates people. Has a real chip on his shoulder toward both. Because he won't hesitate to blaspheme God, and he won't hesitate to lie to and manipulate this woman to cause and bring about her death, okay? And the death ultimately of her husband. Remember that Eve listens to the evil one as he draws her attention to the tree, and I believe that's what the devil does. The devil gets you to look, and you take it from there. He gets her to look at the tree. She sees that the tree looks like it's going to taste good. It can make me wise like God. Here we go, okay? And she eats and gives to her husband, and he eats. And so he makes an even worse choice than she does. She's deceived, remember Paul tells us in 1 Timothy 2. She's deceived. The man's not deceived. He's very specific about that. The man chooses his wife over his God. And we talked about the implications of that, the fact we see that all the time today, that people choose their mate over their God. And it can cost you your soul if you do. It has horrible consequences here for Adam and for Eve. They see they're naked. We talked about how this is bracketed by nakedness. Okay, they're naked and they're not shamed, and then they're naked and they are ashamed. And that's what sin does. Sin makes us vulnerable. Sin makes us feel dirty. Sin causes shame. Sin alienates us, causes, as Adam and Eve do, to hide from God. There are real implications involved in complications in sinning. Now, what I want us to begin to do today is to look at the consequences of this act as we find God addressing the snake, and then the woman, and then the man. Because, again, I think there are some very profound lessons to be found in what happens here. I want to begin reading in verse 12. The man said, "The woman whom you gave to be with me, she gave me fruit of the tree, and I ate." Very early on, what do we got? It ain't my fault, right? The woman, she gave me the fruit, and you gave the woman to me, and so ultimately what? It's kind of your fault that I did this. I mean, how long has the whole victim thing been played? Okay? Since creation, since the garden. Then the Lord God said to the woman, "What is this that you have done?" The woman said to me, the serpent deceived me, and I ate. The Lord God said to the serpent, "Because you've done this, cursed are you above all livestock and above all beasts of the field. On your belly you shall go, and dust you shall eat all the days of your life. I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel." You know, one of the things that fascinates me about what happens here is that you see that not only is there an ultimate consequence to sin, but there are also multiple consequences to sin. Now, the ultimate consequence to the disobedience of Adam and Eve is what? Death. Dying you shall die. Okay, that's the ultimate consequence. But as we're going to see, there are a plethora of other consequences that are also associated with this action. When they eat of the fruit of the tree, it's not like, well, life just continues as it was, they just begin to die. No. All kinds of things are affected. There are all kinds of consequences. You know, it's like when we talk about drug addiction, talk about alcoholism, things like that. You know, ultimately it can kill you. Yeah, it can, and it does. But it can also destroy your dreams, right? Destroy relationships. Destroy all kinds of beautiful things that otherwise would be a part of your life but never will be. And they're not the ultimate price. The ultimate price is death. But it's not like there aren't multiple prices that are paid along the way to death. And so I think it's very, very important here that God says, okay, yes, dying you shall die, but oh, by the way, it's not just that. Now he addresses a serpent first. And of course, we've seen from Revelation chapter 12 that the serpent is the evil one. The serpent is Satan. It's Satan using this creature as his vehicle to talk to the woman. And he tells this creature, this snake, who apparently had legs, right? You're not going to have legs anymore. You're going to grovel in the dust now in the dirt. You're going to eat dirt. Now, we hear Paul, as he writes to the Romans, say that the creation groans. The creation groans because of the sin that was introduced into creation. And it didn't just touch Adam and Eve. It affected everything. I mean, look at the price that nature pays today because of what mankind does. The animals that are abused and taken advantage of. You know, on the news, too regularly, you'll see some poor puppy mill. You know, here's all these puppies and they're half dead and ridden with mites and lice and everything else, you know, and starved to death. And people did that to them. And that's sin that did that to them. Okay, they didn't ask for that. And you see creation groan. And I believe here is the first specific part of that creation groaning is now the snake grovels in the dirt. And he was just used by the Satan. And isn't it fascinating to me? How many of you don't like snakes? Okay, the vast majority of you don't like snakes. Isn't it interesting that there is this almost universal revulsion to snakes? Why is that? I really think it goes back to something of what happened here in the garden. A snake, think about a snake anyway. I mean, the perfect example, I think, of how Satan works. Why do we fear snakes? One of the reasons we fear them is because they're furtive. They hide. They're under a rock, right? They're in a bunch of leaves. They're under a log. And you don't see it. And then all of a sudden what? As Louis can testify, wham, boy, one gets you on the hand. And you never saw it coming. That's how they operate. So often, my daddy talks about when he was a kid growing up that there were people who died in that area where he lived. They'd go out walking at night in the dark in their bare feet and they'd get snake bit. And it'd kill them because you couldn't see the snake in the dark. The fact of the matter is that one of the reasons that we fear snakes is because of their furtiveness, because of the hidden danger that they represent. And so we just kind of basically are revulsed by them. You know, if you think about it, there are a lot of predators that could kill you, but we're not revulsed by them. But we are revulsed by a snake. And so here, I believe you see a creature now paying the price of sin being introduced into creation. This snake crawling now on its belly, eating dirt. And the vast majority of humankind revulsed by its presence. In the midst of that, God slaps Satan up the side of the head, doesn't he? Genesis 3:15. I will put enmity between you and the woman, like there wasn't already enmity, right? I mean, does the snake or does Satan hate people? But listen to him. I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. That's literally the word there. Offspring fits fine, but it's between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise your head, that is, the snake shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. Now, what's going to happen here? He says, let me serve notice, bud. And I love this. The seed of woman. Think about that. I think there's a lot of implications for this biblically as a story, the narrative unfolds. For instance, why I mean, the first family, right? You got two sons that you know of, Cain and Abel. And what do you have in chapter 4? And we'll look at that. You've got one brother killing another, don't you? Just like that, man. Murder. Why? I got to think it's in part because Satan is going, okay, from the seed of woman is going to come one who's going to crush my head. Maybe it's Abel. Let's kill him. We'll just kill him. And as you trace through the rest of the Old Testament, again and again, I think what you see is the evil one working to keep this promise from being fulfilled. Again and again, there are going to be attempts to wipe out the Jews, to wipe out, when it's more specific, the royal line, the line of David. And I believe that is the Satan doing his best to keep this promise from being fulfilled. I believe that's one of the major storylines of the Old Testament. It's how the seed promise, despite all the efforts of the evil one, is fulfilled in Jesus. But isn't it interesting that he words this? It is the seed of woman that's going to crush your head. The seed of woman. There's this little girl, Mary, who's going to bear the only child that's ever been born when the mother's truly a virgin. Is Jesus, in a very real sense, the seed of woman? A specific woman. Yes, he is. His birth, unlike any other birth, a virgin birth. And from the seed of woman will come one who is going to crush your head. Now, when you want to kill a snake, what's probably the most effective way to do it? Either blow its head off with a shotgun, or take a shovel or a stick or something and crush its head. Have people cut off the head of a snake and then been bitten? Yeah, you can cut off the head of a snake and get bit by the snake, can't you? That's not the most effective way to kill it. The most effective way to kill it is crush its head. It can't bite you anymore. That's what the snake's told here. You will be completely subjugated. You will be completely defeated. And that's exactly right. When Jesus dies on the cross and he's raised from the dead, Satan loses what? The power of death over you and me. You see, because we don't have to fear the second death. We've been freed from the second death by the sacrifice of Jesus on the cross. He is completely defeated. He is crushed. His head is crushed. And so even in the garden, at the very start of things, before all of history as we know it unfolds and all the stories come of what will happen between then and now, there's this promise. Listen, let me tell you something, snake. I'm not done with you. And buddy, ultimately, you're going to lose. You're going to lose big time. Because there's going to come one born of the seed of woman, a human being. Of course, he's more than a human being, isn't he? He's God and man. But there's going to come one who will do what nobody else can do. Crush your head. Rob you of the power of death. And so, as God begins to address now those complicit in this rebellion, he begins, first of all, interestingly, by addressing the snake. And again, the snake faces the consequence of sin entering the world. I believe the snake, in a very real sense, is a victim, as is creation, a victim of the sin that has infected the world and polluted the world. But he's talking to more than the snake, isn't he? He's talking to the one who had inhabited the snake. He's talking to the Satan. And he's telling the adversary, Oh yeah, let me tell you something. This ain't over. Not even close. And you haven't won, and you're not going to win. There's going to come one who's going to crush your head. Next week we'll look at what he says to the woman. Would you bow with me, please? Father, we're so thankful for your word and so grateful for the insights that it gives us into who we are and why we're like we are, and the beauty of your grace and your love and the provision that you make for us, often in spite of us. And Father, as human beings, we know that we so often fail you. We eat of that fruit that we shouldn't eat. We rebel, and we just stand in awe of your grace and of your power. And we do pray, Father, pray for your protection from this vile, evil one who would separate us from you, who would destroy us because he hates us. Thank you for protecting us. Thank you for delivering us from him. Thank you for a son who was willing to come and die that we might be freed from bondage to him. Father, please continue to bless us in this new week and help us every day to glorify you in what we do. And we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you.